Good afternoon. I'm Jahi Chappelle. I want to thank Gary and Cam Webb for uh, helping me work out how I can give this presentation, even though I can't join you all in Indonesia. So I'm going to talk in the next 10 plus minutes about some of the concepts regarding land sparing I've been thinking about recently, and more specifically, some of the conceptual problems I see with it. So to start with, to put it in a broader context, I view land sparing as basically an attempt to answer the question of perhaps the most fundamental problem of sustainable development: how we can provide enough food for today's population and a growing future population, while also addressing the significant and increasing rate of loss of biodiversity. As I think most of the people here or there in Indonesia are familiar with, the proposed solutions fall broadly into two camps. One being characterized as land sparing, essentially the idea that if we grow more food on less land, we can save more of the total land area for conservation of biodiversity. Wildlife-friendly farming, in contrast, essentially says that we can do both on the same agricultural land, support biodiversity, and generate food. I'm going to only be talking about the land sparing end of the spectrum today. So what do I mean by lacks a credible political economy? What I want to do is to break down land sparing and show how I feel like it's composed of what you might call a number of misspecified hypotheses that go into the overall hypothesis. What I mean by this is it omits important variables and dynamics of political economy, and through this omission, it constrains the solutions and approaches that we might consider in terms of applying them to the problems or even in terms of what we research. So specifically, I think perhaps the prime misspecification is that land sparing doesn't address hunger per se, but actually estimated aggregate food demand. This is an important conflation because most people think of, well, we need to produce this food to feed people. But when you look at the estimates, for example, the classic paper by Balmford et al., they estimated a need in 2050 for around 8,000 calories per person per day for the global north, the more developed countries, and 6,000 for the less developed countries. This is based on per capita crop harvest, rather. And so this is before losses to food waste and feed to livestock, which is why these numbers are so high. Similarly, the FAO numbers that are very often used extrapolate from the current trends and predict that we're going to need 3,500 calories per person per day in the global north and 3,100 in the global south. The problem of this is that it omits the political economy of hunger. The past 30 years plus have shown us empirically and theoretically that there are profound differences between food need and the market demand for food. As a result of sidestepping or eliding this question, it obscures some other important ones I think we need to ask. For example, it discourages the question of looking at need versus demand. Specifically, we could ask, why not define the amount of food needed now and in 2050 as essentially the recommended daily allowance of food of around 2,300 calories per person per day, and adding on top of that perhaps some reasonable allowance for some degree of unavoidable food waste. Well, of course, part of the reason that we don't simply define it as 2,300 calories is because that doesn't reflect the reality right now. People are consuming and demanding much more than that. But this itself just raises the question of why not, instead of or in addition to intensification and theoretical land sparing, we work to reconnect need and demand and decrease the mismatch between the two. It further raises what I think is a very interesting question of how we might disaggregate the amount of food demanded in the market vis-a-vis the needs of the poor. To use a possibly frivolous analogy, if you think about the market for private jets, if we projected based on the current market what the demand would be in 2050, what this would tell us is how many people from a small proportion of society might be able to afford private jets in the future based on a small proportion that can afford them now. What it would distinctly not tell us is how many people in the future that want jets would be able to acquire or afford them and therefore exert demand in the private jet market. Now, consumption of food is projected to rise because of rising income, but it does appear that a disproportionate amount of that will be among people who have access to enough or nearly enough food beginning to mimic elite food patterns, rather than the poorest necessarily gaining access to food markets. So I think in turn this obscures the trade-offs that we're being asked to make. That is to say, intensive agriculture is pretty universally acknowledged to have negative direct effects on on-farm biodiversity and to some extent off-site biodiversity. Uh, so we're being asked at least to give up some biodiversity of some non-zero magnitude in some sites. What we're getting in trade, however, is a continued world where we have hunger and obesity co-occurring, a world that Raj Patel has termed a stuffed and starved world, where for the first time in history we have the same number of obese and the same number of starving. The other problem is that both of these trends are on the increase. So if we simply project from current patterns, which is what we've done for aggregate demand, then we have to also presume that the current patterns in malnutrition and obesity are going to continue as well. So we're looking at a future with 1.2 billion of each if we don't do something more than simply intensification. So what are the alternatives? I think one thing that we need to more seriously look at is how we might address and change dietary shifts. It's pretty widely agreed, for example, that meat is less resource efficient than other forms of food. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, meat is much more intensive. So rather than accepting that people are going to eat more meat, it seems to me like it behooves us to ask how we might change this, especially when people are eating much more meat than they might need for health reasons. I think we also need to look at decreasing food waste. Up to half of our food is wasted, and while not all of that can be recovered, there's still a significant amount that likely can be. And if you look at some recent research, Lundqvist et al. Estimated that of the total edible crop harvest in, I think, 1990s, around 4,600 calories per person per day, only 2,000 of that ended up being available to the consumer. Most of this difference went into animal feed, with a significant amount also going into food waste. So as I said, I think it's worth asking, given that there are costs associated with intensification, what are the comparable costs of trying to decrease the amount of food, the amount of meat eaten, and therefore the amount of food going to animal feed, as well as looking at how we can recover food losses.